You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
One of the things I should say is that I like to give a lot of information. And what I hope you'll do is if it's not landing in a way that makes sense to you, is that you'll ask me about it. So it really is a Socratic way of teaching. I present information, and then if you engage the information and have questions about it and ask about that, we can delve into the particular aspects that are of interest to you. There's way more information to offer than can be offered in this time frame. And so it's better that if we focus on things that are interesting to people who are here than just try and do a survey of all of the information. So please bear that in mind. This is a meditation-based class, so that most of the remedies that I'm going to be offering you are going to be in the form of meditation practice. The thing about mentalizing and emotional regulation is that you have to train the mind to be able to do that. Um, we whether if it's a good way of thinking about it, learn to emotionally regulate from instructions that we receive. We learn to mentalize from instructions that we receive. And when we talk about deficits in mentalizing and emotional regulation, we're really not saying that you're incapable of learning it or you did something wrong in learning the system that you did. You actually learned the instruction that was offered to you and you learned it well and have been able to use it all of this time. And so the deficit is not in your capability, the deficit is in the instructions that you've received. Most people use the emotional regulation strategies that they learn in childhood all of their lives. And the only time that anybody adds to it is if you have an intimate relationship with somebody where you're privy enough to the way that they do it that you can learn another approach. But the problem with addiction is that relationships don't tend to be so intimate. They're either transactional or in a trauma bonding way. And so we don't tend with people on this end of it to expand so much, so that we need to really learn that. As I'm saying that, I'm thinking, well, maybe I should tell you a little bit about my history and why this matters to me, be teaching it. I was one of those kids who started drinking in elementary school. I grew up in an affluent, educated family, but my father was sadistic and abusive in all the ways that kids can be abused. And my mother was an addict and alcoholic. My father was also an alcoholic, but he didn't seem to be an addict on substances. He was also a physician, so he was the prescribing doctor for my mother's pharmaceutical supply. Um, the when I was in treatment and I did my family tree, all of the all all of the adults in my family on both sides and all of my aunts and uncles were all alcoholics, and all of the first cousins were alcoholics. I mean, it was pretty much 100% hard drinking Irish family. You could set your clock on it, and I bet somebody's going to open the refrigerator at 12 noon precisely, and I would put $5 on the table, and they would take the bet. And at exactly 12 noon, somebody would open the refrigerator and crack the first beer of the day, because the rules in our family was you were an alcoholic if you drank before noon, and you were an alcoholic if you drank hard liquor before 5. And I would put another $5 on it. Say, I'll bet you somebody opens the refrigerator at 5. No one would take the bet, but that door would swing open and the ice cubes would be thrown into a glass. Um, I had a terrible time. I was a gay kid and somewhat effeminate. couldn't play sports particularly well. And I grew up in a family where you can't be gay. And so the level of secretness that I had to maintain, which I didn't do that well, was really epic. And there was a lot of uh, criticism. My mother constantly instructing me how to present myself so that I wouldn't be effeminate. And you know, you're holding your fork wrong. You're picking up your glass wrong. You shouldn't hold your hand like that. You got off your bike wrong. I mean, just a constant litany of that. So it ended up making me extremely self-conscious and very shut down. Um, I left home at 17 and moved from a big, a beautifully decorated house to the street because it was better than staying home. And um, I drank a lot. So my cocktail of choice was alcohol, speed of some variety, marijuana, and poppers. That was the perfect chemical cocktail. Um, I dropped out of college and moved to New York. When I was 22, my brother killed himself, and I basically was drunk for about a year and a half and ended up with cirrhosis of the liver at 23. So you just have a trajectory of that. And I was told by the doctors, either I stop now or I'll be dead in 6 months. And I actually couldn't stop. And so I by chance ended up in an AA meeting and was able to get sober. So I've been sober since about, well, I've been sober from substances since October of 1978, so quite a while. And then over the next 10 years or so, addressed the main process addictions for me, which were around money and sex, food. Basically, I should just say I have them all except for gambling, and I don't know what went wrong there. In the 12-step world, the 11-step tells you to go seek help from other places if you need it. And I found that um, the depression that I had always came along with me even into sobriety, and it was really the extreme emotional experiences that I had that were so difficult to manage. The main strategy in 12-step is to withdraw from stressful activities. And so I was letting so many opportunities go by that I couldn't really manage, that I was bereft by the lack of meaning. Um, which is when I started psychotherapy. I thought that that would be helpful. And so I have had 28 years of psychotherapy with really good people. And that was very helpful. The the community of recovering people was very helpful. The psychotherapy was very helpful, but it didn't really affect the underlying pattern of my life, which was I could start things, I could get sort of into the middle of some things, but I could just never finish anything. It was the emotional distress would get so great that I would have to withdraw from the activity in order to regulate the emotion and stay sober. I'm glad that I was able to do that because it would have gotten much worse, I think, if I hadn't. But it was also a life of no finishes is also increasingly painful. And then I seemed to have the same relationship over and over again, which was, I functioned so poorly. The only people that would be in relationship to me were people that also functioned really poorly. And so we would have these very volatile, unsatisfying attempts at connection that didn't really go very well. Because of the history of sexual abuse, and because I was sexually abused by both parents, my sex life functioned better with in complete anonymity rather than with people that I knew. So there was that piece as well. Then AIDS swept through everything, made it even more complicated. And and then the thing that happens to most of us, I think, is that in my mid 30s, I just gave up on the difficulty of relationship because they kept wrecking everything, and I wanted to try and get something done in my life, and so I let go of relationships and tried to focus on getting things done, and I could get some things done a little bit. I had dissociative identity disorder. I don't know if you know your DSM at all, but in the 90s, when I was in my 40s, I began to address the dissociation that interrupted everything. And lo and behold, in my early 50s, I was able to hold a job. That was a complete transformation of everything because the money didn't run out all the time, which was the thing that happened before. But the same pattern of my life was what was operating. And so, can you hear that a weed blower thing that's in the background? It'll be here for a minute or two, and then it'll be done. Quite by chance, in the late 90s, I heard about attachment theory, and the light went off in my head. This guy is describing the pattern of my life in 10 minutes. And I've been in therapy for 20 years, and they didn't quite understand what was happening for me. And so I began to look at how does one address the attachment issues. And there wasn't really that much. It was still in the research side of things. I couldn't find a single therapist that knew anything about attachment, but I could recognize some of these basic problems. The mentalizing, the emotional regulation were very applicable to meditation practice. And I thought the explanation, the understanding of this would be enough. When I started to teach this in the communities that I was teaching, there was a lot of disorganized people and a lot of addiction. And so I focused on organizing this around that. So I did the research on and liked Alan Marlat's work and his, mainly on the relapse side, because I think that that's really what's important. When things get bad enough, we tend to be able to go into a period of abstinence or harm reduction, and then not be able to sustain it over a long period of time. And so that's where my focus ended up. We did that for about 5 years, and at the end of it realized that we weren't actually changing people's native attachment strategy. What we were doing is giving them a new set of skills to operate their existing attachment strategy. And so what I think we should all understand about this process is that we have grown in early childhood a brain that functions in our native attachment mode, and we're not going to get new brains out of this. What we're going to get is new software to operate in the same hardware, or my friend Jimmy would say, wetware that we've grown in the brain. And there's a couple of ways to do this. One is you begin to understand the dynamics of secure functioning relationships, and you begin to operate relationally in a secure way so that you can set up secure functioning relationships and have those around you. That gives you a greater basis of support than to do the deep work of changing the native attachment strategy and earning security if you don't have it. As all things being as unfair as they are in this life, dismissing people is the easiest fix. So if you're an organized dismissing person with addiction, that's going to be the easiest path to long-term abstinence and harm reduction. If you're disorganized, there's a lot of things that need to happen in order for that shift into security. But I can tell you, as somebody who at 65 managed to earn their security, I'm 71 now. The difference between my life before that and after that is night and day. It's so much easier. It's worth doing. And the earlier you can do it, obviously, the regret of doing it at 65 is the 6 decades where I didn't have it. But it's so good, it's worth doing it any time. So I think that that's important to understand. The So in the research that we did in these 4 modules, craving and urging is the first one that we look at. And what we're really talking about here is the habit of emotional regulation that we develop, the skill set of emotional regulation that we develop, using the Dan Siegel model for this. He calls it the window of tolerance. We're all capable of reacting to a certain intensity of experience emotionally without needing to do anything about it. But if the intensity exceeds our capacity, then we have an emotional event that needs to be regulated. And the mind will think of the strategy that it needs or that it has associated with regulating. If you've used addiction or either process or substance addictions for a long time, then the mind has it set up that when this happens, we use this strategy to regulate it. And if you've been using substance or process addictions, the mind thinks of that strategy. And so in the beginning, when you're attempting to change this, that particular piece of the association takes a while to shift. And you're going to have to replace it with a strategy that works better or at least as good as the addictive strategy that you're used to using. So we're not so concerned about that initial thought of using that arises when you're having an emotional event that needs to be regulated. Is that making sense so far? What we want you to do is to begin to mentalize, I'm thinking of using, which means there's an emotional experience in the present moment that's dysregulating me. One of the things that dismissing people miss in this whole thing, since they don't allow a conscious experience of emotion, is that something's just happened that's distressing because they don't allow themselves the conscious information of that. So the mentalizing skill here is something's just happened that's dysregulating me emotionally, and that's why I'm thinking of using. Is that making sense? So there's a cognitive piece here. Urging is where you allow yourself the thought of using. So do you ever notice yourself fondly remembering a time when using felt good, or planning what you might do next? These days, it's mainly food for me. So I'm suddenly thinking about recipes that I could go cook, right? And then I realize, oh, I'm having an emotional event that needs to be regulated. I've been sober for 45 years, so I don't remember it that well, what it used to be like. And some of the horror stories stand out more than the pleasant experiences. So as I'm describing this to you, what I'm describing to you is somebody who can actively mentalize their thought process and their emotional process. One of the things that you'll notice in the literature, if you examine it, is that dismissing people mentalize pretty well. So it's going to be easier for you to track that. Disorganized people don't mentalize very well. So the challenge here is to be able to pay attention to all of these things that are happening fast enough so that you can track them. Dismissing people don't allow awareness of emotion consciously. So one of the things that dismissing people need to do is to begin to pull the filters that don't allow emotional experience consciously so that you can allow that experience. Anders? In the beginning, it's unlikely that you're going to catch that first thought of using. This is part of the curve of training. What you're going to notice is, you're going to catch yourself thinking about using or preparing to use or thinking, planning about what you might do in order to use. And then trace it back. That's what you do. Here I am again in a loop thinking about this. I'm going to trace it back to the present moment and see if I can understand what's happening. The reason that this is so urgent with craving and urging is that the cognitive mind is the aspect that keeps the understanding that I'm just thinking about this, I'm not actually intending to use. But if you don't attend to the underlying stressor and it gets too intense, the cognitive mind will fail. And then you won't be able to tell the difference between a self-soothing thought process and an actual plan of action. And so you'll find yourself lapsing. Is that making sense? So the important thing to do here is to understand, if you notice that you're urging, you need to suppress the thought process and replace it with something else as fast as you can. Okay. In the chat, there's a question about dismissing. Dismissing people, or they're called anxious avoidant in childhood, have typically a childhood of profound neglect, and so and that's defined as a caregiver who's present but unavailable. So a depressed parent, a parent that's also an addict, and so the child recognizes a shift in the mental states of the person as they get intoxicated and are unavailable, sensitive. Depressed is very common. And so the child learns that the caregiver is unresponsive to the full range of experience. Most of the time, neglecting parents require the child to perform in a way that's agreeable to the parent. And so there's a suppression of all negative affect. Many people in the introductions described a sense of shame, and where the shame aspect comes is when you present yourself authentically, you express your authentic attachment needs. Your attachment needs are rejected and you're shamed for having them in the first place. So that natural inclination to connect to the child and to present yourself in an authentic way and your needs in an authentic way are rejected. And then you're shamed for having those needs in the first place. So what you learn to do is hide them. Don't express them so that you can avoid the experience of being shamed. That produces in an adult a real reluctance to present anything authentically because your expectation is that you'll be rejected and shamed. And that was so painful in childhood that you can't really risk it. And then if you do happen to risk it, the anticipation of rejection and shame is what takes over often. So that's the exploration piece, right? When you create a world where you experience authentic expression as a trigger for your rejection and shame, you really don't do it. It's just not something that makes sense. Underneath that is the abandonment terror. So imagine a child who's not protected and not taken care of, and what a terrible, fearful experience that would be. And so that fearfulness is then transformed into a perception of rejection. So dismissing people are hypersensitive to the their experience of being rejected. This is quite different than how fearful, avoidant, or complexly disorganized people experience the world. In the Buddhist way of talking about this, you have the capacity to sense the object that can be sensed when there's contact. A consciousness of that sensing experience arises. It's evaluated for urgency. Does it need immediate attention? Does it not matter whether we attend to it? Is there time for a pleasant experience? And then it's compared to the perceptual database. And if there's a previously coded meaning to that kind of experience, it's attached. And so that ultimate sensing experience then rolls into conceptual reality with all of those meanings of the past attached to it. And if you keep making a reality where you're being rejected, you become extremely sensitive to that. Underneath that experience of rejection, and usually the expression of anger that comes with that, is the abandonment terror. That making sense? And so this process is regulating. Attachment is really the way of regulating abandonment terror. You could say that that's it. Organized and disorganized people mean that there's a reliable response to that. So that dismissing people tend to react in a predictable, dismissing way. Preoccupied people tend to react in a predictive, preoccupied way. Secure people tend to react in a predictable, secure way, which is the basis of reliability. The leaf blower is quite loud. Is the software filtering it out, or? The problem with disorganization is that you can't predict how somebody's going to respond, which creates a foundation of lack of reliability. So the main difference between organized and disorganized is that disorganized people are perceived as unreliable because you can't predict how they're going to respond. In adults mentalizing, we make the intention to communicate to somebody. We understand what that's going to be. We formulate it so that they'll understand what we're trying to communicate to them. We pay attention to how they react to that communication, and we modify our understanding of the situation based on their reaction. When you can't predict how somebody's going to respond to the way that you communicate to them, you can't formulate the expression in a reliable way that's communicative. And so in your experience of attempting to communicate to them, they become unreliable. What can happen to dismissing people or you're being in relationship to a dismissing person is that when you formulate what can be expressed to them, it has to leave out everything that's negative, so that you can't really present a problem to a dismissing person because they can't hear anything negative. It's called idealizing. Everything has to be presented in an ideal way to them, or they react with the experience of rejection and anger. We have a phrase for that, which is walking on eggshells around somebody. You know that? Dismissing people do pretty well, and because they're focused on material things, they tend to do materially the best out of all of us. They're the main reason that they do that is because they learn in childhood to suppress their emotions, and the way they learn to do that is by focusing away from things that have emotional content. So they focus away from people, and they focus away from relationships onto things. And they replace the connection to things with the connection to people. And so they're very thing oriented. In order to get things, you have to have resources to acquire them. So they get focused on gathering resources. Because they want to be able to transact relationships, they focus on power positions because that helps them transact relationships. They tend to focus on positions of high social value because that helps them to transact relationships. They can trade access to high social value situations for the things that they want. Secure people don't focus so much on that. They focus more on meeting their primary exploration needs. They focus on the meaningfulness of life. And so they gather the time, energy, and resources that they need to support those pursuits. And depending on how our culture values those activities, they pursue what they need to in order, based really more on that. I mean, we'll pay a top golfer $2 billion over the course of a career, and we'll pay a teacher, $800,000 over the course of a career. It's just culture isn't. Our culture has its set of values. Let's put it that way. We let people live in tents on the street in our culture. It's so troubling to me that we would do that, and particularly with addiction. 15 years ago in LA, half of the people living on the street were families who couldn't afford rent. And now it's mostly the fentanyl meth problem. I don't know if it's reached you yet, but it's an epidemic here. I call them meth zombies because this new P2P meth is so debilitating on people. So you have a thought of using, what's preceding that thought of using is a reaction to the present moment. So you've made a meaning of the present moment, which is accompanied by a strong emotional reaction that exceeds your capacity to tolerate intense emotions. One of the issues that we have as addicts is that we come from family systems where the toleration of emotional intensity is really low most of the time. It's coupled with a tolerance for high levels of pain. And the combination of those two really makes us ripe for using substances and processes because we allow ourselves to get into high levels of pain, which then need to be addressed. But our emotional tolerances are so low, we can't interact with other people around conflict that might be causing the painful situations. Is that making sense? So then we need to regulate this high level of pain, and we can't do it relationally. And so we're pushed into the substances or processes. So we need to increase our capacity for intense emotional experiences, and we need to do everything we can to lower our tolerance for pain so that we react earlier before the situations get totally out of hand. Secure people, one of the things that I think addicts think about secure people is that they have a comically low pain tolerance. Before it's even registering for us as a painful situation, they're already histrionic about changing something. It's hilarious. Lucy.
I'm a little confused. Are you speaking of low level of emotional tolerance, right? And high pain tolerance, meaning physical pain?
Yeah, or painful situations, things that you would track as painful or unacceptable. When the emotional experience, the emotional dysregulation intensifies, the cognitive mind shuts down in relationship to it. So that in a relational experience of trying to uh, negotiate a solution to a conflict in a relationship, that's largely a cognitive function. So if you don't have high tolerances of emotion, your cognitive mind shuts down and you're just in a dysregulated state. So you can't make much progress on the negotiation of finding a solution to the relational difficulty. And then because we're very protective, particularly if we have shame of what our authentic needs are in the relationship when we don't express them, we manage a much higher level of pain in those areas not being satisfied. And it really has to get almost unbearable for us to express it. And then it's at, we're at a 10, but we didn't address it at a 2, at a 3, at a 5, at a 7. I think that most of the time we're going to grow up in a family system where there's some version of that. Because the family system is incapable with the skill set that they have to resolve the conflicts, there's some suggestion that it's morally correct to tolerate them. I believe in my family, the phrase was grin and bear it. I don't know if you've heard that. Yeah, in my family system, if you went to work, you were fine. If you didn't go to work, there was a problem. So is this pretty clear? Something happens in the present moment. The reaction exceeds the window of tolerance, which causes the mind to look into the database of current strategies for regulating that situation. If you're currently using some addictive strategy to regulate that experience, the mind thinks of using. And that initial thought of using is then followed by the self-generated emotional narratives that we use to regulate ourselves, the thought processes that we use to regulate ourselves. So the mind is regulating the pain experience by thinking. So the pain level exceeds the window of tolerance, and then the mind is thinking. That's what I'm talking about. And then what we're beginning to mentalize is, I have a pain in my knee and my mind thinks this. That means that my mind is set up to think this kind of thing to regulate that experience. That's the mentalizing piece. Is that making sense? Now, if you had a lower tolerance of pain, you would have moved your knee 5 minutes ago. Or if you have the family system that says you have to tolerate high levels of pain, you'll sit there in the pain trying to regulate it long after you should have just moved your leg. Is that making sense? Or you'll find out that you have nerve pain because you didn't move your body enough. You're supposed to move it. You've ever seen in meditation places people walking around with donuts to sit on it because they forced themselves to sit through the pain that caused nerve damage because their levels of pain are so high. Pain tolerance are so high. Whereas the person who doesn't have that is constantly fidgeting. We get really annoyed with them for doing that. Actually, their level of pain is better than ours if we're sitting through those high levels of pain. But Peter, you were describing that perfectly. The pain is there, it exceeds the window of tolerance, and then my mind is distracting me in thought. So it's pulling you out of the present moment experience into the thought experience. That's what's regulating. You lose awareness of the distress by getting wrapped up in thinking. And then what we want to do is examine, what are those strategies? Is it a good strategy or is it not a good strategy? And if it's a thought of using substances or processes, it's not a good strategy. We need to suppress it immediately and replace it with something that's beneficial. That's this piece. So if you've done my level 1 or my level 2, this stack is investigating self-generated emotion, stopping afflictive self-generated emotion, and then quantumizing the pool of poison and pain, because the stress, anger, and depression piece is this system that stores the pain that exceeds the whole system tolerance, and then having clarity between them. But the reason that we start here and focus on this more is because this is the fast conduit into lapsing. If you allow yourself to indulge in a self-soothing fantasy of using, and you don't understand or attend to the underlying stressor, and that process tilts, particularly if you suppress awareness of your emotions, you won't know that the emotional intensity has gotten so intense that your cognitive mind shuts down. And then you'll just be in the activity of using. Have you ever had that experience of finding yourself using when you didn't want to use? What you'll notice then is that the shame spiral happens. And so we call that the abstinence violation effect. You use, it relieves the distress enough that the cognitive mind turns back on. And then the cognitive mind is going in horror. Oh my God, you've used again. What are you doing? We didn't want to do this. And then the avalanche of shame hits you. Now, the problem with the avalanche of shame is that it's an intense emotional reaction that needs to be regulated. And if your habit is regulating shame with using, the mind will think of using again. And if you allow the mind to think of using to regulate the shame experience, which is unbearable, and you don't attend to the underlying stressor that's now buried under 2 levels of crap, you will find yourself lapsing again. And then you'll have another heaping pile of shame dumped on top of that. And at a certain point, that experience is so dysregulating, you find yourself using at the same level that you were using before. That's the spiral of this. So you lapse, which is a single episode of using when you're trying to stay abstinent. Lapse again, because the intensity of the distress keeps increasing. Each time that happens, the doses have to go up. And at a certain point, you reach the level of using where you were before. And that can happen breathtakingly fast. And it starts with the thought of using in reaction to some ordinary stressor that we then allow our minds to engage in. Is that making sense so far? So we have about 20 minutes or so. I'm going to take you through a short Vipassana meditation on tracking the thought processes that we use to engage the development of mentalizing around this particular aspect of craving and urging. So the software systems filter out all of the bells, and all of the approaches that we've tried to get the bell to work have been futile. And so I'm just going to say we're going to start the meditation period and we're going to end the meditation period, and there won't be a bell. So let's start the meditation period. Go ahead and take your posture. Okay, let go of the meditation. So any comments or questions about that? Yeah, noting and labeling. So what we're trying to discern is the difference between a quiet mind, a mind that's engaged in thinking about the present moment, and a mind that's engaged in the thinking about the future or the past. I can give you an example because I think that we should give them pithy names when we develop awareness of them. I have one that I call Superman, which is where something is going terribly wrong and I rush in and save the day. I have one I call the Ranter, which I'm basically pushing a shopping cart down the middle of the street, screaming at everybody that I pass by. So those become recognizable to me. I have one I call terrorist, where I save the day, but I'm always at the end surrounded by the people that I want to impress in the hospital bed where I'm, near death. So we do live in a culture where violent fantasy is considered relaxing. So, all right. We're going to stop and take a break. If there's any more questions about the technique, we can pick them up when we come back.